I woke to the sound of low voices drifting through the thin crack under my bedroom door. The house was still dark, and the air felt heavier than usual, as if something had settled into the walls overnight. I lay there for a moment, trying to separate the words from the quiet, until one sentence came through clearly, sharp enough to pull me fully awake. "He won't remember we took it." The whisper belonged to my younger brother, and hearing it in my home at this hour sent a cold, clean jolt through my chest. It wasn't concern, it was planning, and it wasn't meant for me to hear. I pushed the blanket aside and sat up slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light seeping through the hallway. My memory hasn't been perfect the past few months. Stress has a way of making things slip, but I'm not lost, and I'm not confused. I remember what matters. I remember when something feels off, and that whisper carried the weight of something I wasn't supposed to notice. I eased out of bed and walked toward the door, keeping my steps quiet. By the time I reached the hallway, the voices had faded, leaving only the faint creak of a floorboard somewhere deeper in the house. I stayed still, letting the quiet press in, then moved toward my study. The door was half open. I never leave it that way. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper, like it always does. But something in the arrangement felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. One drawer on my desk was pulled just enough to show it hadn't been closed properly. I placed my hand on the handle and slid it open. The inside looked disturbed. The neat order I kept shifted into something careless. A space that should have held a small item, a specific one I always kept in the same corner, was empty. I didn't panic. I didn't call out. I simply noted the absence and the timing. I straightened, letting the silence settle while my mind moved through possibilities. My brother had been visiting more often lately, claiming he wanted to check on me, though his eyes always moved around the house more than they ever settled on me. With the whisper still echoing softly in my head, the meaning behind those visits felt different now, sharper, more intentional. I stepped back from the desk and reached for my phone on the table beside it. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow across the room. At the top sat a notification from Mrs. Dalton's doorbell camera, the neighbor who lived close enough to catch anyone approaching my front path. I tapped it open, expecting nothing more than a stray cat or a package delivery. Instead, the thumbnail showed the faint outline of someone moving near my porch earlier in the night, long before dawn. The shape wasn't clear, but the timing made the air feel even colder around me. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the frozen image on the screen while the quiet of the house deepened around me. My brother's whisper lingered in the back of my mind. No longer just words, but a shift in the ground beneath me. Something had been taken. Something mattered, and they believed I wouldn't remember. They were wrong. I sat in the quiet of my study for a long while, letting the uneasy stillness settle into something I could think through. Silence is familiar to me, but that morning it carried a different weight, one shaped by the past as much as the present. My brother and I grew up without parents by the time I was barely a man, and he was still young enough to look at me the way most boys look at a father. I fed him, guided him, and held the house together until he was old enough to stand on his own. But even back then, I sensed a small resentment in him whenever I made decisions he didn't like. Responsibility came to me by necessity, and he never quite forgave the fact that I wore it better than he could. Those old tensions never disappeared. They just went quiet for a while, quiet enough to blend into daily life. But whenever family property came up, whenever paperwork needed a clear head, he always tensed. He didn't like that everything official came through me, that our parents had left me as the primary holder of what remained. He smiled through. But smiles don't fool a man who spent his youth navigating loss and duty. I learned early on to read the truth behind a face. Mrs. Dalton, my neighbor, had always reminded me that some people watch out for you simply because it's the right thing to do. She had lived next door for 20 years and treated me with a steadiness I never asked for, but valued quietly. Whenever she saw something odd near my place, she'd check in without fuss. If my light stayed off too long or a package sat outside, she noticed. The notification from her doorbell camera wasn't a coincidence. She trusted me enough to keep a watchful eye, and I trusted her enough to know she never alerted me without reason. My brother, on the other hand, had started saying things recently that made the air in the room shift. Short comments dropped in casual moments. "You should let me handle everything now," or "It's time I take some weight off you." They were spoken lightly, but each one carried a tone I couldn't place. Not kindness, not help, something closer to positioning. When I downplayed the offer, he'd push a little more the next time. A few weeks back, he came over with a stack of papers he called simple updates, medical forms, financial preferences, things he claimed would save time if anything ever happened. The way he checked whether I read each line made my stomach tighten. I brushed it aside then, telling him I didn't need changes right now, but the look he gave me wasn't disappointment. It was calculation. And all of this started around the same time the town began murmuring about land developers buying up properties near ours. Sudden interest, sudden visits, sudden concern for my well-being. It didn't take much to connect the timing. His urgency didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew with every rumor, every sale, every piece of news that made our family land look more valuable than it had in years. Sitting alone in the dim morning light, I realized the silence in my house wasn't just strange. It was dangerous, not because of my memory, but because my brother believed he could move pieces while I wasn't looking. He was wrong about that too. I found my brother in the kitchen later that morning, acting as if he'd been up for hours, though the strain around his eyes said otherwise. He greeted me with a smile that felt stretched too thin, the kind a man puts on when he's trying to hide the shake in his voice. Before I said a single word, he asked, "Did you lose something? You looked off earlier." I hadn't mentioned anything missing. I hadn't even opened my mouth. The question hit with quiet force, sharper than the whisper I'd heard at dawn. I watched him closely as I answered, keeping my tone even. "Not sure," I said, shrugging faintly. "Maybe I misplaced something." His eyes flickered in a way he couldn't control, a quick dart of panic before he buried it under another smile. "Well, if you figure it out, just tell me," he said, voice light, almost cheerful. It didn't match the tension in his shoulders. It didn't match the whisper I had heard hours earlier. Something in him was rehearsed, as if he'd practiced this conversation in his head. His wife came in behind him, hair unbrushed and steps uncertain, as if she'd rushed to appear casual. "Oh, maybe that thing you were looking for is in the garage," she blurted out, her voice too fast, too defensive. I hadn't told her I was missing anything either. Her explanation didn't match his question, and the contradiction hung between them like a crooked picture on the wall. She caught my eyes for a second, then looked away, pressing her lips together as though she'd said too much. I let the silence grow for a moment, then nodded slowly, playing into the image they thought they could use. "Maybe," I said, keeping my tone mildly confused. If they believed I was unsure, they'd reveal more than they intended. Their faces relaxed just enough to show they took the bait. Once they left the kitchen, I returned to my study. The room felt the same as earlier. Still, dim, faint scent of old paper lingering. But now I forced myself to look with sharper eyes. I opened the drawer again, careful not to disturb anything I hadn't already touched. A folder labeled Estate Notes lay near the front, but when I lifted it, it felt too light. I opened it, completely empty. Not a single page remained. The folder itself wasn't important. The absence of its contents was. As I set it down, something near the desk leg caught my eye. A small torn corner of paper lay face down on the floor, the edge rough as though ripped in haste. I picked it up between my fingers and turned it over. A fragment of someone's handwriting curved across the scrap. Not mine, not neat, and not familiar. It wasn't enough to reveal anything, but it was enough to say that someone had handled papers they shouldn't have touched. Someone careless. Someone in a hurry. I stood still, letting each piece fall into place in my mind. My brother's sudden concern, his wife's rushed excuse, the empty folder, the torn paper, none of it proved anything outright. But together, they formed the beginning of a pattern they didn't expect me to see. When my brother returned to the doorway, his smile returned with him. Wide, bright, wrong. "Everything okay?" he asked, voice smooth but stretched thin. I let myself look confused again, softening my posture. "I'll figure it out," I said quietly. His relief came too fast, like a man stepping off a cliff and praying the ground would rise to meet him. And that was all I needed to know. I waited until the house settled into its usual afternoon quiet before opening the Doorbell camera app on my phone. The thumbnail still sat at the top of the screen, displaying that faint, blurred figure near my porch. I tapped the image, and the video opened with the low hum of nighttime audio, the kind that picks up every shift of wind against the microphone. The timestamp flashed, 2:13 a.m. I was asleep long before then, and no one had any reason to visit me at that hour. I let the footage play without blinking. My brother appeared in the frame with slow, cautious steps. He didn't bother knocking. Instead, he pulled a spare key from his pocket, the one he shouldn't have still had, and slid it quietly into the lock. Watching him enter my home with the familiarity of someone who believed he had the right sent a cold line of tension through me. His shoulders were hunched, not from fear, but from intent. A man hides his face when he knows he shouldn't be seen. He didn't hide his. He assumed no one would ever look. I watched him disappear inside, leaving the porch light blinking behind him. The video continued until he returned, minutes later. In his hand was a folder, thin, dark, and roughly the same size as the empty estate notes one I had found earlier. He held it against his chest as he glanced over his shoulder, checking the street with quick, darting eyes. The movement was sharp, nothing like the casual visits he used to make during the day. This was the walk of someone who expected consequences, but hoped to outrun them. As he reached the edge of the porch, car headlights flickered on from the curb. I paused the video and looked closer. A silhouette sat inside the vehicle, still waiting, tense. I recognized the outline of my sister-in-law's hair, the way she tilted her head when watching for someone. She wasn't simply giving him a ride. She was part of the timing, the planning, the silence. The car didn't move until he slid in beside her with the folder pressed tight against him. Then, the headlights shut off again, and the camera view turned dark. I let the video run twice more, watching each movement carefully. Nothing about their behavior was casual. Nothing was innocent. I tapped the time code and wrote it down in my notebook. Then I added the date, the angle of his approach, the shape of the folder, the length of time he spent inside. Documentation wasn't new to me. It was habit, one that had kept me grounded through grief, property disputes, and the details people tried to gloss over. If they believed my age made me slow, they misunderstood the difference between forgetful moments and deliberate thought. The house felt different once I set the phone aside. Not violated, just unfamiliar, as if I was seeing it from a step back instead of from within it. I moved through each room with a quiet, methodical calm, checking drawers and shelves without disturbing anything. It wasn't panic. It was clarity. If one thing was missing, there might be more. And I wasn't going to assume the theft stopped at a single folder. In the study, I opened the remaining drawers. Papers that should have been aligned weren't. A few covers were bent where they shouldn't be. Small shifts, small signs, all pointing in the same direction. Someone moved through my life while I slept, confident enough to believe I wouldn't piece it together. They never expected me to look this closely, and I wasn't finished yet. I found it late in the evening, after the house had settled into that thin quiet that comes only after a long day of pretending everything is normal. I returned to the study with the same steady focus I'd been carrying since seeing the footage. I opened the lower drawer, the one I rarely touched except for important documents, and felt my stomach tighten the moment my hand brushed the empty space inside. A single folder was missing, and it wasn't just any folder. It held the original proof of ownership for the old family land, the one piece of property my brother had always argued should have been his. Seeing that empty space felt like a slow, controlled punch beneath my ribs. I knelt down and pulled the drawer fully open, checking the back panel and the sides, hoping I'd misplaced it, hoping for a small mistake. But the truth stayed still in front of me. The file was gone. It didn't take much to understand why. Developers had been sniffing around the area for months, buying land from anyone willing to sell. That document was the only thing preventing anyone, especially him, from claiming the property as theirs. Without it, he could move faster than I ever expected. A soft rustle near the trash bin caught my eye. I stood and walked to it, lifting the lid with slow care. Inside were crumpled pieces of paper. Not mine, not with my typical markings or pen pressure. I uncrumpled the top sheet and felt the air go thin around me. My name was written across the signature line, shaky and uneven, as if someone had tried again and again to mimic my handwriting. Another sheet held a slightly different version, the curve of the letters practiced but wrong. They weren't drafts of anything official. They were attempts, trials. Someone had been rehearsing my signature in the quiet of my own home. I set the papers down on the desk and let myself breathe, slow and steady. Anger didn't flare. It settled, heavy, cold, clear. This wasn't just theft. This wasn't impatience or misunderstanding. This was preparation, meant to push me out of my own rights before I understood what was happening. As I walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water, I heard movement behind me. My sister-in-law stepped in from the hallway, startled to see me awake. She froze for a second, then forced a smile that didn't sit comfortably on her face. "You're still up?" she asked, voice too light. When I didn't answer, she glanced toward the study, her eyes darting like someone checking if a plan was still intact. Then she muttered under her breath, barely audible, "Once it's transferred, he won't fight it anyway." She said it to herself, not noticing I had heard, not realizing the house carried sound more easily at night. The sentence landed harder than anything I'd found in the drawer. They weren't just taking something. They were counting on my recent memory lapses, small moments that came and went, to paint me as someone who wouldn't notice, someone who wouldn't remember, someone who wouldn't object. I let her pass without speaking. She didn't look back. When she disappeared into the bedroom she shared with my brother, I stood in the middle of the dim hallway, every piece of the truth finally aligning in my mind. They were moving while I was vulnerable. They believed I wouldn't catch up, but I had. And now I understood one thing with absolute certainty. I had to act before their plan hardened into something I couldn't undo. I drove to the edge of town early the next morning, long before my brother woke. The retired attorney lived in a small brick house behind the old courthouse, a place that always smelled faintly of paper and rain. He had mentored me years ago when I first started handling the family affairs, teaching me the kind of caution most people learn only after losing something. When he opened the door, he studied my face for a brief moment, then stepped aside without asking questions. He had always been good at reading the look of a man who'd reached a breaking point. We sat at the long oak table in his study, the same table where he once showed me how a single missing line in a contract could change a man's life. I slid the printed footage, the torn papers, and the empty folder across the wood toward him. He put on his glasses, leaned forward, and began reviewing each item with slow, deliberate attention. He didn't speak while he worked. He let the evidence speak first. When he finally leaned back, he set the papers down and looked at me with a level, steady gaze. "This is a property seizure attempt," he said. No hesitation, no softening, just truth placed plainly on the table. I felt the words settle in my chest, heavy but clean. Hearing them out loud didn't shock me. It clarified everything I already knew. He picked up the altered draft with the shaky signature attempts and tapped the corner with his finger. "They're building a trail," he said. "A sloppy one, but a trail all the same." He pointed out the sections where the rights to the disputed land had been rewritten, lines I hadn't noticed yet, tucked between familiar paragraphs to look harmless at a glance. The legal structure was simple. Once my signature was on the new document, the land would belong entirely to my brother. No shared rights, no discussion, no return. He explained the timeline in the calm, measured tone he used whenever he wanted me to absorb every detail. If my brother filed the documents quickly, with or without a clean signature, the process could begin before I realized anything had moved. Reversing it would require hearings, proof of intent, and a long uphill push that could drain time and energy most men my age didn't have. "He's counting on speed," the attorney said, "and on you not pushing back soon enough." I took a slow breath, letting the weight of his words stretch through me. My brother's urgency, the whisper in the dark, the empty drawer, it all pointed to a single truth. He wasn't waiting for an opportunity. He was creating one. And every quiet moment in the house now felt like a countdown. The attorney folded the papers neatly and placed them back in front of me. "He may try to rush you soon," he said, "before you gather your footing." He spoke without judgment, only with certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from years of seeing men lose what was theirs because someone else moved faster. He reached into a file cabinet and pulled out a fresh stack of documents. "I can prepare counter-filings," he said, "and a witness statement confirming these attempts. You'll be protected before he makes his next move." His tone wasn't dramatic. It was practical. The same tone he used the day he taught me to never sign anything under pressure. As he handed me the papers, something inside me steadied. Not anger, just clarity. I knew now that I wasn't dealing with confusion or paranoia. I was dealing with intent. And it was time to meet it with my own preparation. By the time I returned home that evening, the air in the house felt tight, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My brother was waiting at the kitchen table, elbows planted, fingers tapping in uneven rhythm. The moment I walked in, he straightened and reached for a stack of papers he had placed neatly in front of him. "We should go over the updated documents tonight," he said, trying to sound calm, but the urgency in his voice cracked through every word. It wasn't a request, it was a push. Before I could answer, his wife appeared from the hallway with her arms crossed and frustration written plainly across her face. "You take too long to understand things," she said bluntly, as if she'd grown tired of pretending patience. The tone wasn't careless, it was revealing. She was done hiding the pressure behind polite smiles. Now they wanted speed. Now they didn't care how they sounded. I gave a slow, quiet nod, playing the same role I had carried for days, the older man who needs time, space, and extra explanation. My brother relaxed only slightly, mistaking silence for compliance. He pushed the papers toward me, but I kept my hands by my sides and said nothing. I could feel the thin layer of control he held over himself slipping. His leg bounced under the table. His breathing came uneven, shallow. He stood, paced twice, then sat again, wiping his palms on his jeans as if sweat had gathered. I excused myself for a moment, moving down the hallway with calm, measured steps. When I reached the porch, I made 2 quiet calls. The first was to the attorney, who answered on the first ring. I told him the time, the tone, the pressure. He didn't hesitate. "I'll have the protective filings ready within the hour," he said. "Keep him talking. Don't sign. I'm on my way." The second call was to Mrs. Dalton. She didn't ask questions. She simply said, "I'll be nearby." Her voice steady and certain, the way it always was when she sensed danger moving toward my door. When I stepped back inside, my brother was pacing again, his movements sharper, more frantic than before. He didn't look at me at first. He muttered to himself, words I couldn't catch, punctuated by short bursts of anger he tried and failed to swallow. When he finally faced me, his eyes had the unsettled gleam of a man racing against a clock only he could hear. "We don't need to drag this out," he said, voice raised just enough to betray the strain he was trying to hide. "Just sign it so we can all move on." His wife hovered behind him, arms crossed tighter now, her gaze flicking between me and the door, as if she expected someone to interrupt at any moment. She wasn't good at hiding nerves. Her foot tapped the floor faster than his leg bounced. She whispered something to him, but he waved her off, too consumed by whatever timeline they believed they were running out of. I sat down slowly at the table, letting each movement project calm. Inside, my thoughts aligned with quiet precision. The confrontation was close. The truth would be laid out soon, but I couldn't reveal that I knew anything. Not yet. My strength now came from restraint, from patience, from letting them believe they still held control. My brother slid the pen across the table toward me, leaning forward with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't touch it. I wasn't afraid. I was ready. My brother pushed the papers across the table with both hands this time, the force of it sliding them right up to my elbows. His jaw tightened, and he leaned forward as if crowding my space would make the pen move faster. "Sign it," he said, his voice low and strained. "We're done waiting. Just sign the papers." The demand wasn't loud, but it carried the brittle edge of a man who felt his window closing. I rested my hands flat on the table, keeping my expression calm. "Before I sign anything," I said quietly, "I want to talk about what you took." The air snapped tight around the sentence. His face flickered. First confusion, then fear, then the frantic attempt to rearrange his expression into something neutral. He opened his mouth too quickly. "We didn't take anything," he said, the words tumbling out unevenly. "If you lost something, that's on—" He cut himself off, swallowing hard. His wife stepped closer, eyes wide. "He's confused," she said sharply. "Don't start this again." Her voice shook, and she glanced toward the hallway as though expecting someone to appear. I didn't raise my tone. I didn't accuse. I simply said, "The drawer in my study was opened. The folder is gone, and I heard you talking outside my room before sunrise." That was all. The truth, placed plainly between us. My brother blinked, struggling to assemble a lie that didn't exist. "We were just checking on you," he stammered. You must have misplaced. Look, let's not make this bigger than it is." Before he could twist the story further, a knock sounded at the front door, firm, steady, unmistakable. My brother flinched like someone struck. I stood without hurry and opened it. The attorney stepped inside first, carrying a thick folder of printed documents. Mrs. Dalton followed, her expression calm but alert, clutching the stack of doorbell footage she had printed at his request. My brother took a step back when he saw them, his face draining of color. "What is this?" he whispered. His wife immediately tried slipping toward the back door, but Mrs. Dalton moved gently into her path, placing a steady hand on the doorframe. "Stay where you are," she said softly. "This won't take long." There was no threat in her voice, just certainty. We all returned to the table. The attorney laid the footage printouts in front of my brother, one after another. The late-night entry, the use of the spare key, the folder in his hands, the waiting car. He said nothing as he placed each page down. He didn't need to. The images spoke louder than any accusation. My brother stared at the photos, trembling slightly. This isn't what it looks like," he said, voice cracking. "I was just checking something, helping. He's been forget." His words collapsed under their own weight. Every excuse contradicted the one before it. The attorney added the attempted signature drafts next, setting them beside the footage with quiet precision. My brother's eyes darted between them, panic breaking through whatever composure he had tried to hold. His knees buckled. He sank into the chair, elbows on the table, head in his hands, his breathing hitched in uneven bursts. Not anger, not denial, but the sudden collapse of a man confronted with the truth he thought he could bury. No one spoke. No one moved. The evidence sat between us like the only honest thing in the room, and for the first time since this began, he understood there was no story left to rewrite. The attorney moved quickly after leaving my house that night. By dawn, he had filed an emergency injunction that froze every legal pathway my brother could have used to transfer the land. It was a simple document, but its weight was undeniable. It ensured nothing could change ownership without my explicit approval. When he handed me a copy, the official stamp still warm from the clerk's desk, I felt something inside me ease, not triumph, just the quiet relief of knowing the ground beneath me had stopped shifting. The days that followed unfolded with an unsettling calm. My brother was served with charges for attempted fraud and unlawful entry. He didn't deny the evidence. He couldn't. The footage, the draft, the documents, all of it painted a picture too clear to run from. His wife faced her own charges, aiding in the attempted transfer and coordinating with a local real estate contact who had been expecting papers that never arrived. Nothing dramatic happened during the arrests. No shouting, no protests, just two people realizing the system had finally stepped in where family loyalty had failed. When the court date arrived, I walked into the building slowly, feeling the weight of every step. The attorney stayed close beside me, his presence steady and unobtrusive. Mrs. Dalton met us inside, giving me a small nod that carried more comfort than a dozen words might have. I took my seat in the second row, hands folded, breathing controlled. The courtroom felt colder than usual, the hum of distant conversations echoing through high ceilings. My brother sat at the defense table, shoulders slumped, hair unkempt, eyes fixed on a spot near his shoes. He didn't look at me. His wife sat 2 seats away, her expression stiff, her gaze hollow. The judge read the charges in a clear, even voice. No drama, no emphasis, just facts laid out the way the law requires. I listened, not with anger, but with a heaviness I hadn't fully felt until that moment. Betrayal is quieter in a courtroom than people expect. It doesn't scream. It sits beside you like an unwanted companion. The attorney leaned slightly toward me as the proceedings continued. "This protects you now," he said softly. "You're safe from any further attempts." I nodded without speaking. Protection was necessary, but it didn't erase the ache of understanding what my own blood had been willing to take from me. I wasn't mourning the land, documents. I was mourning the part of my brother I had believed was still good. After the hearing ended, the courtroom slowly emptied. I stayed seated for a moment, letting my thoughts settle. Mrs. Dalton rested a hand lightly on my arm. "Some family you choose," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Some family chooses itself." Her words landed gently, without pity, without judgment. Just truth from someone who had stood beside me when others stepped away. We walked out of the courthouse together. The sun felt warm on my face, a small reminder that the world outside continued moving, even after trust had been broken. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt steady, rooted again in a life that had almost been taken from me in silence. And for the first time in a long while, I knew the system had protected me, not because I was old, but because I had fought back with clarity. The week after the hearing, the house felt different, quieter, but not in a way that made me uneasy. It was the kind of quiet that comes when the last storm cloud drifts off and the world finally exhales. I spent a full morning walking through every room, checking locks, closing drawers properly, and removing the spare keys I once handed out too freely. The attorney helped me finalize new protections, updated documents, secure storage, and clear instructions that left no gaps for anyone to crawl through. Every signature I placed felt deliberate, grounded, and entirely mine. With each precaution set in place, the tension that had lived in the walls began to ease. I realized then that age hadn't dulled my judgment at all. It had sharpened it. What had nearly harmed me wasn't the passing of years. It was the moments when I let trust go unquestioned, simply because it came from family. Blind trust is a quiet kind of danger. It creeps in through kindness, settles under routine, and waits for an opportunity. I had allowed that once. I would not allow it again. I began writing a few notes in a small journal each morning, not to mourn anything, but to remind myself of simple truths. Read everything, move at your own pace, ask why. These weren't warnings so much as anchors, small habits that kept my footing steady. I didn't turn them into lessons for others. I didn't repeat them to anyone. They were mine, shaped by the life I had lived and the pain I now understood, with a clarity that didn't need dramatics. My routines returned slowly but firmly. I made my coffee in the same chipped mug I'd used for years. I walked the yard at sunrise, trimming branches and checking the fence line the way I always had. I kept my study organized again, each folder in its place, each drawer closed with intention. The small acts of daily life felt stronger now, not because they changed, but because I had reclaimed them. Independence isn't loud. It's a quiet, steady presence, the certainty that your life is still yours to manage. I made a point to visit Mrs. Dalton one afternoon. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any. We sat on her porch, watching the neighborhood in the fading light. She talked about the weather and her garden, and I listened with the kind of comfort that comes only from people who stand by you without wanting anything in return. On another day, I met the attorney for lunch. He spoke plainly, as he always had, and accepted my thanks without turning it into something sentimental. Those two, without ever planning to, held up the parts of my life that nearly fractured. As days unfolded, the house regained its rhythm. No tension in the hallway, no whispers behind doors, no stolen moments of doubt when I walked past my own study. What remained was steady, honest, and quiet enough for me to hear myself think again. One evening, as I closed the final drawer in my study, I paused with my hand still on the handle. The events of the past weeks didn't replay. They simply sat there, clear and grounded, like a truth I now carried without fear. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong people is.